I opened the pill bottle hidden under my pregnant daughter's mattress, and when I read the label, my blood ran cold. The doctor's name wasn't Dr. Chen. It was someone I'd never heard of, and the pills inside weren't prenatal vitamins. If you're dealing with family members who might be hiding dangerous secrets, please subscribe and share your story in the comments below. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone. My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm 58 years old, and I've been a registered nurse for 35 years. I thought I'd seen everything in my career at St. Mary's Hospital, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered in my own home. After my husband David passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, this old Victorian house on Maple Street became my sanctuary. The creaking wooden floors that used to drive him crazy now comfort me with their familiar symphony. This morning started like any other September day. I was brewing my usual pot of Colombian coffee in the kitchen, watching the steam curl up toward the ceiling as autumn rain tapped gently against the bay windows. The house smelled of cinnamon from last night's apple pie, mixed with that distinct scent of old wood and memories that fills every corner of this place. I'd been living alone for so long that the silence had become my companion. Then I heard the front door creak open, followed by shuffling footsteps on the hardwood floor of the entryway. "Mom, are you home?" Sarah's voice called out, sounding tired and strained. My heart swelled with unexpected joy. Sarah is my 28-year-old daughter, my firstborn, and seeing her standing in my kitchen doorway with her hands protectively cradling her 7-month pregnant belly was the best surprise I'd had in months. Her long chestnut hair hung limp around her shoulders, and she looked exhausted. But she was here. My daughter was home. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" I rushed over to embrace her, careful not to squeeze too tightly. She felt thinner than I remembered, despite her pregnancy. "Are you okay? Is everything all right with the baby?" Sarah sank into one of my kitchen chairs, the same ones David and I bought when we first moved into this house 28 years ago. "Tom and I broke up, Mom. For good this time. I need somewhere to stay until I figure things out." Tom Bradley had been Sarah's on-and-off boyfriend for 2 years. I'd met him exactly 3 times, and each encounter left me with an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite articulate. He was charming enough, with his easy smile and quick wit, but there was something behind his eyes that reminded me of patients I'd seen in the ER who were hiding their pain behind false bravado. "Of course you can stay here, honey. This will always be your home." I squeezed her shoulder gently. "Are you hungry? I can make you some scrambled eggs. You need to keep your strength up for the baby." Sarah's face brightened for the first time since she'd walked through the door. "That sounds perfect, Mom. Thank you for not asking a million questions about Tom." As I busied myself at the stove, whisking eggs, and adding a touch of cream the way Sarah had loved them since childhood, I watched her from the corner of my eye. She kept shifting in her chair, running her hands through her hair nervously, and checking her phone every few seconds. When I placed the steaming plate in front of her, she ate with the hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. "The baby's room upstairs is exactly how you left it," I said, pouring her a glass of orange juice. "I've been keeping it clean, just in case. Mom, you don't need to go to so much trouble. I just need a place to crash for a few weeks while I sort everything out." Something in her tone made me pause. "Sarah, you know you can tell me anything, right? If something's wrong, if you're in any kind of trouble." She looked up from her eggs, and for just a moment, I saw a flash of something in her brown eyes. Fear. Guilt. But then she smiled that same smile she'd given me since she was 5 years old, whenever she'd broken something, and was hoping I wouldn't notice. "Everything's fine, Mom. Tom and I just weren't compatible. Better to figure that out now than after the baby comes, right?" Over the next few days, I threw myself into taking care of Sarah. I stocked the refrigerator with all her favorite foods, including those expensive organic crackers she'd craved during her first trimester. I washed and folded her clothes, made sure she had extra pillows for her back, and even drove to 3 different stores to find the specific brand of herbal tea she said helped with her morning sickness. Having her home filled the house with life again. I'd forgotten how much I missed the sound of another person moving around upstairs, the rustle of someone else making themselves tea in the kitchen at night, even the gentle hum of the shower running in the morning. Robert, my 25-year-old son, had moved to Chicago 2 years ago for his job at an accounting firm, and while we talked every week, it wasn't the same as having family physically present. But there were small things about Sarah's behavior that nagged at me. As a nurse, you develop an instinct for noticing when something isn't quite right, even when you can't put your finger on exactly what it is. She was unusually protective of her bedroom, always keeping the door closed and locked. When I offered to help her unpack, she insisted she could handle it herself. She slept at odd hours, sometimes not emerging from her room until well past noon, then staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning. I could hear her moving around up there, pacing back and forth across the creaky floorboards. Her appetite was inconsistent, too. Some days she'd eat everything I put in front of her. Other days she'd barely touch her food, claiming the baby was pressing against her stomach. But the thing that worried me most was how jumpy she'd become. If I entered a room unexpectedly, she'd startle like a frightened animal. If the phone rang while she was nearby, she'd freeze until she was sure it wasn't for her. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. I'd been gardening in the backyard, deadheading the last of the summer roses before the first frost, when I realized I'd forgotten to mention that I'd scheduled her a prenatal appointment with Dr. Chen, our family physician who delivered both Sarah and Robert. "Sarah, honey," I called as I climbed the stairs to her room. "I made you an appointment with Dr. Chen for next Tuesday. You haven't had a checkup since you've been here. And the baby." "Mom, no!" Her voice came through the closed door, sharp and panicked. "I don't need you to make appointments for me. I'm 28, not 14. I can handle my own medical care." I stopped at the top of the stairs, struck by the intensity of her reaction. "Sweetheart, I was just trying to help. When's the last time you saw a doctor?" There was a long pause before she answered. "I've been seeing someone. A specialist. You don't need to worry about it." "What kind of specialist? Is everything okay with the baby?" My nursing instincts kicked into high gear. Specialists during pregnancy usually meant complications. "Everything's fine, Mom. Please, just trust me on this. I don't want to see Dr. Chen. I have my own doctor." That night, as I lay in bed listening to Sarah pace back and forth in the room above mine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. In 35 years of nursing, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was telling me that my daughter was in trouble. But I didn't know that she was hiding secrets that would put my future grandchild's life in danger. Suddenly, I wasn't standing in the quiet hallway of my house anymore. I was back in my small apartment downtown 5 years ago, watching my 23-year-old daughter Sarah lying unconscious in a hospital bed, machines beeping around her, like a mechanical symphony of fear. The memory hit me with the clarity that traumatic moments always seem to retain, no matter how much time passes. October 15th, 2020. That was the day that changed everything for our family. Sarah had been driving home from her job at the marketing firm downtown when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of her Honda Civic. The impact crushed her left leg and pelvis, requiring 3 surgeries and months of recovery. But the physical injuries weren't what nearly destroyed her. It was what came after. Dr. Martinez, the orthopedic surgeon, had prescribed OxyContin for Sarah's pain management. 40 milligrams twice daily for the first 2 weeks, then a gradual reduction as her bones healed. I remember being relieved that modern medicine could spare my daughter the agony I'd seen in countless patients during my nursing career. I had no idea I was watching the beginning of a nightmare that would consume the next 5 years of our lives. At first, everything seemed normal. Sarah followed her medication schedule precisely, attended every physical therapy appointment, and complained appropriately about the limitations of being confined to bed. David and I took turns staying with her at her apartment, making sure she had everything she needed. She seemed to be healing beautifully, both physically and emotionally. The first red flag should have been when she called Dr. Martinez's office, claiming she'd accidentally dropped her pills down the bathroom sink drain. She needed an early refill, just this once. The office staff, sympathetic to a young accident victim, authorized a replacement prescription. I even drove her to the pharmacy myself, proud of how responsible she was being about her recovery. By the time her bones had fully healed, Sarah should have been weaning off the pain medication. Instead, she'd somehow convinced Dr. Martinez that she was still experiencing breakthrough pain that required continued treatment. When I gently suggested that perhaps it was time to reduce the dosage, she became defensive. "Mom, you don't understand what it feels like. Just because the X-rays look good doesn't mean I'm not still hurting. The doctor knows what he's doing." Looking back now, I can see how naive I was. As a nurse, I'd dealt with addiction countless times, but somehow I'd developed a blind spot when it came to my own daughter. I wanted so desperately to believe that she was just being cautious about her recovery that I ignored every instinct telling me something was wrong. The lying started small. She'd claimed to have appointments that didn't exist, need money for copays that seemed unusually high, or ask me to pick up prescriptions from pharmacies across town because they had her insurance information on file. Each request seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they painted a picture I refused to see. David started voicing concerns first. One evening as we were getting ready for bed, he turned to me with worry etched across his face. "Margaret, something isn't right with Sarah. Yesterday, when I went to her apartment, she could barely keep her eyes open. But when I asked if she was feeling okay, she insisted she was just tired from physical therapy. She's been through a traumatic experience," I replied, brushing off his concerns. "It's going to take time for her to feel like herself again." But privately, I'd started noticing things too. Sarah's pupils always seemed either too large or too small when I visited. She'd nod off mid-conversation, then jerk awake and pretend she'd just been resting her eyes. Her apartment, once meticulously clean, became increasingly cluttered and dirty. When I offered to help her organize, she'd make excuses about being embarrassed by the mess. The first time Sarah asked me for money, it was for what seemed like a legitimate reason. Her insurance company was being slow to reimburse her for medical expenses, and she needed $400 to cover her rent. I wrote the check without hesitation, grateful that I could help my daughter during such a difficult time. Over the following months, the requests became more frequent and increasingly creative. She needed money for a specialized physical therapist who didn't take insurance. Her car required expensive repairs that couldn't wait. Her employer was cutting hours due to budget constraints. Each story was plausible, each amount seemed manageable, and I found myself dipping deeper and deeper into my retirement savings without really keeping track of the total. It wasn't until I sat down to do my taxes in 2021 that I realized I'd given Sarah over $12,000 in less than 6 months. When I confronted her about it, she broke down in tears, insisting she'd pay me back as soon as she was fully recovered and able to work more hours. She seemed so genuinely remorseful that I couldn't bring myself to refuse her promise to make payment arrangements. The stealing started around the same time, though I didn't recognize it immediately. Pills would go missing from my medicine cabinet, but Sarah always had reasonable explanations. She'd had a particularly bad day and needed an extra Tylenol. She'd accidentally knocked over my pill organizer and wasn't sure if she'd gotten everything back in the right places. My prescription reading glasses disappeared and reappeared so frequently that I started to think I was developing early dementia. David's death in January 2022 changed everything. One moment he was shoveling snow from our driveway, joking about how retirement meant he finally had time to appreciate winter weather, and the next moment he was gone. Massive heart attack, the paramedic said. He probably didn't even know what was happening. Grief hit our family like a second collision, devastating in entirely different ways. Sarah seemed to take her father's death harder than I did, which I attributed to guilt over how much stress her situation had caused him. She started disappearing for days at a time, not answering her phone, not responding to text messages. When she'd finally reappear, she'd be thin and hollow-eyed, claiming she'd been staying with friends who were helping her process her loss. I was dealing with my own overwhelming sadness and didn't have the emotional energy to push for details. The house felt impossibly empty without David's presence, and I threw myself into settling his estate, dealing with insurance companies, and trying to figure out how to live as a widow after 33 years of marriage. It was during this period that I made what I now recognize as my biggest mistake. When Sarah showed up at my door in tears, claiming she was being evicted from her apartment because her grief had caused her to miss work and fall behind on rent, I didn't hesitate. I took out a home equity loan for $18,000 and paid her debts, believing I was giving her a chance to start fresh. Within 6 months, she was back, asking for more money for different reasons. This time I insisted on seeing documentation, which led to our first real confrontation about her behavior. She accused me of not trusting her during the most difficult period of her life. I accused her of taking advantage of my generosity. We both said things we couldn't take back. Sarah entered her first rehabilitation program in November 2022. After I discovered her unconscious in my bathroom with an empty prescription bottle beside her. The 12-week program cost $8,500, which my insurance didn't cover because she wasn't technically my dependent anymore. I mortgaged my house to pay for it, convinced that professional help would finally give me my daughter back. She completed the program and seemed genuinely committed to her sobriety. For almost 6 months, Sarah was the person I remembered from before the accident. She attended Narcotics Anonymous meetings religiously, maintained steady employment at a local grocery store, and even started dating someone she'd met in group therapy. I allowed myself to believe that our nightmare was finally over. The relapse was swift and brutal. One day she simply stopped answering her phone, stopped showing up to work, stopped attending meetings. When I finally tracked her down at a motel on the outskirts of town, I found her in a condition that still gives me nightmares. She went through 2 more rehabilitation programs over the next year and a half, each costing thousands of dollars I didn't have, each ending in the same disappointing pattern of initial success, followed by devastating failure. By the time Sarah showed up pregnant on my doorstep last month, I had lost nearly $60,000 trying to save her. My retirement account was depleted, my house was mortgaged to the maximum, and my credit cards were maxed out. But when I saw her standing there with her hands protecting her growing belly, all of that seemed insignificant compared to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this baby would give her the motivation she needed to stay clean. I wanted to believe that pregnancy had changed her, that maternal instincts were stronger than addiction, that my future grandchild represented hope instead of another potential tragedy. But everything changed the day I found that first bottle of pills hidden in her bathroom. Finding that first pill bottle was like discovering a crack in the foundation of everything I'd allowed myself to hope for these past few weeks. I was cleaning the downstairs bathroom, the one Sarah had been using since she'd moved back home, when I noticed a small orange prescription bottle that had somehow rolled behind the toilet. My nursing instincts kicked in immediately as I picked it up, checking to make sure no medication had been accidentally lost. OxyContin, 80 milligrams. The bottle was nearly empty, with only 3 pills rattling around the bottom. But when I looked at the prescription label, my blood went cold. The doctor's name printed in small black letters read, Dr. Michael Rivera, M.D., with an address I didn't recognize. I'd been a nurse for 35 years and knew every pain management specialist within a 100-mile radius of our town. There was no Dr. Michael Rivera. I stood there in that small bathroom, holding the evidence of my worst fears, feeling my hands start to shake. The prescription was dated just 5 days ago, which meant Sarah had somehow obtained 80 pills of one of the most powerful opioid painkillers available, and she'd already consumed most of them. My first instinct was to confront her immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of all our previous fights about her addiction, or maybe it was the desperate hope that there could be some reasonable explanation. Instead, I quietly placed the bottle back where I'd found it and went upstairs to my bedroom to think. That evening, I tried to observe Sarah more carefully. During dinner, now that I knew what to look for, the signs were impossible to ignore. Her pupils were constricted to tiny pinpoints, despite the dim lighting in the dining room. She kept nodding off between bites of the pasta I'd made, then jerking awake and insisting she was just tired from the pregnancy. When she reached for her water glass, I noticed her hands had a slight tremor that she tried to hide by keeping them in her lap when she wasn't eating. "Sarah, honey," I said gently, cutting into my chicken. "How are you feeling? You seem exhausted lately." She looked up at me with those constricted pupils and forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mom. Just the 3rd trimester, you know. The baby's getting heavier and it's harder to get comfortable at night. Maybe we should schedule you an appointment with Dr. Chen, just to make sure everything's progressing normally." The change in her demeanor was instant and dramatic. Her fork clattered against her plate as she set it down harder than necessary. "I told you already, I have my own doctor, Dr. Rivera. He's a specialist in high-risk pregnancies." "Dr. Rivera?" I tried to keep my voice neutral. "I don't think I've heard of him. What hospital is he affiliated with?" Sarah's eyes darted away from mine, focusing intently on her pasta, as if it required her complete concentration. "He's new in town. Has a private practice on the east side. Mom, I'm 28 years old. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own prenatal care." "Of course you are, sweetheart. I just worry because I haven't seen any of your recent ultrasounds or lab results. As a nurse, you know I can't help but be concerned about both you and the baby." Sarah pushed her chair back from the table abruptly. "There you go again, trying to control everything. I'm going to my room. I have a headache." As she left the dining room, I noticed she moved with the careful, deliberate steps of someone trying very hard not to appear intoxicated. Each footfall was placed with exaggerated precision, and she held on to the banister as she climbed the stairs despite claiming the handrail was just for balance due to her pregnancy. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. Sarah's sleep schedule was completely erratic. Some nights I'd hear her pacing in her room until 3 or 4 in the morning. Then she wouldn't emerge until well past noon. Other times she'd fall asleep on the living room couch at 7 in the evening and sleep for 14 hours straight. Her appetite fluctuated wildly, too. One day she'd eat everything in sight, claiming the baby was making her constantly hungry. The next day, she'd push food around on her plate and insist she was too nauseous to eat more than a few bites. I started keeping a mental log of these patterns, and they didn't match any normal pregnancy symptoms I'd encountered in my nursing career. The phone calls started around the same time. Sarah's cell phone would ring at odd hours, and she'd always take the calls in her room with the door closed. When I asked who had called so late, she'd claim it was Tom checking on the baby, or her former co-worker asking about shift coverage, or someone from her prenatal class confirming meeting times. Each explanation seemed plausible in isolation, but together they painted a picture that made my stomach churn with anxiety. Robert called on a Thursday evening while Sarah was taking one of her extraordinarily long showers. My 25-year-old son had always been perceptive, even as a child, and I could hear concern in his voice immediately. "Mom, how's Sarah doing? Really doing?" he asked without preamble. "She's adjusting to being back home. Why do you ask?" "I tried calling her yesterday to ask about the baby, and she sounded weird, like really weird. Her speech was slurred and she kept losing track of what we were talking about mid-sentence. When I asked if she was okay, she got defensive and hung up on me." My heart sank. Robert lived in Chicago and hadn't been around Sarah during her worst periods of addiction. If he was noticing concerning behavior after just one phone conversation, the situation was probably worse than I'd realized. "She's been tired lately," I said carefully. "The pregnancy is taking a lot out of her." "Mom," Robert's voice was gentle but firm. "I know you want to believe the best about Sarah, but this sounded like more than pregnancy exhaustion. Has she been acting strange around you too?" Before I could answer, I heard Sarah's bedroom door open upstairs. "Let me call you back later," I whispered into the phone. That weekend, everything came to a head during what should have been a pleasant family dinner. I'd invited my neighbor Lisa Martinez, who'd been Sarah's best friend all through high school, hoping that spending time with someone from her past might lift Sarah's spirits. Lisa arrived with a beautiful bouquet of yellow roses and a gift bag filled with baby clothes she'd picked up on sale. She'd always been like a second daughter to me, and seeing her genuine excitement about becoming an honorary aunt to Sarah's baby made my heart swell with bittersweet emotion. "Sarah, you look amazing," Lisa said, embracing my daughter carefully. "Pregnancy really suits you. How are you feeling?" "I'm good," Sarah replied, but I noticed she avoided making eye contact with Lisa. "Just tired all the time." As we sat down to eat the pot roast I'd been cooking all afternoon, I watched the interaction between the two women who'd once been inseparable. Lisa chatted about her new job at the bank, her recent engagement to her longtime boyfriend, and her excitement about planning a baby shower for Sarah. But Sarah seemed unable to focus on the conversation, giving delayed responses and occasionally asking Lisa to repeat questions that had just been asked. "So, when's your due date?" Lisa asked, cutting into her roast. Sarah paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, looking confused. "December," she said finally. "December what? Early December? Late December?" Another long pause. "The 15th. Lisa smiled. "That's so exciting. What has Dr. Chen been saying about how everything's progressing?" The question seemed to snap Sarah out of her fog. "I'm not seeing Dr. Chen. I have a new doctor, Dr. Rivera. He specializes in complicated pregnancies." Lisa glanced at me with raised eyebrows. "Complicated? Is something wrong with the baby?" Sarah's face flushed red. "No, nothing's wrong. He's just more experienced with women who have had medical issues in the past." The euphemism hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Lisa knew about Sarah's addiction history, but she'd never seen Sarah in this state before. I watched my former neighbor's expression change from confusion to recognition to deep concern. "Sarah, are you feeling okay right now?" Lisa asked gently. "You seem a little out of it." "I'm fine." Sarah's voice had an edge to it now. "God, why does everyone keep asking me that? I'm pregnant, not dying." The rest of the dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. Lisa tried valiantly to keep the conversation going, asking about nursery preparations and whether Sarah had chosen names for the baby, but Sarah's responses became increasingly short and defensive. By the time we'd finished eating, the atmosphere in the dining room was thick with unspoken tension. After Lisa left, promising to call soon, I found Sarah in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter with both hands. Her knuckles were white, and she was taking deep, shaky breaths. "Sarah, honey, are you having contractions?" I asked, immediately shifting into nurse mode. "No, I'm not having contractions." She turned to face me, and I saw something in her eyes that terrified me. It wasn't just the constricted pupils or the slight glassiness that indicated intoxication. It was desperation. Raw, undisguised desperation. "Then what's wrong?" She opened her mouth as if to answer, then closed it again. For a moment, I thought she might finally tell me the truth. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and looked at me with defiance. "Nothing's wrong, Mom. I'm going to bed." As she walked past me toward the stairs, I caught her arm gently. "Sarah, if you're in trouble, if you need help, you can tell me. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." She pulled away from my touch as if I'd burned her. "I don't need your help. I need you to stop treating me like I'm still a child." But as she walked up the stairs, I heard her stumble on the 7th step, the one that had been slightly higher than the others for 28 years. Sarah had climbed those stairs thousands of times throughout her childhood and adolescence. She could have navigated them blindfolded, unless she was too intoxicated to trust her own coordination. That night, I lay in bed listening to her move around in the room above mine, and I knew that the daughter I'd been trying so hard to believe in was slipping away again. But this time, she was taking my future grandchild with her. And then she crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in early November, exactly 3 weeks after I'd found that first prescription bottle. I'd spent those weeks documenting every suspicious behavior, every inconsistency in Sarah's stories, every sign that my pregnant daughter was spiraling deeper into addiction, while my future grandchild remained trapped in the chaos. The confrontation started over something that should have been routine. Dr. Chen's office had called that afternoon to confirm Sarah's appointment for Thursday morning, the one I'd scheduled weeks ago despite her protests. When I mentioned it over dinner, Sarah's reaction was immediate and explosive. "I told you I don't need to see Dr. Chen," she said, slamming her fork down so hard that her plate jumped. "Cancel the appointment. I have my own doctor." "Sweetheart, you're 7 months pregnant, and you haven't let me see a single medical report or ultrasound since you've been here. As your mother and as a nurse, I'm concerned about both you and the baby." Sarah's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "You're not my nurse, Mom. You're supposed to be my mother. There's a difference." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm despite the rage building in my chest. "Then, as your mother, I'm asking you to help me understand what's going on. The late-night phone calls, the sleeping all day, the way you can barely keep your eyes open during conversations. Something isn't right." "Nothing is wrong with me." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You want to know what's wrong? You are. You're suffocating me. You watch every move I make. You question everything I do. You treat me like I'm still that 23-year-old girl who got hurt in a car accident." The words hit me like physical blows, but I forced myself to stay seated, to keep my voice level. "Sarah, I found the pills." The color drained from her face instantly. For a moment, she looked like a trapped animal, eyes darting around the dining room as if searching for an escape route. Then the defiance returned, harder and more desperate than before. "What pills?" "The OxyContin bottle in the bathroom. 80 milligrams prescribed by Dr. Michael Rivera, who doesn't exist." I pulled the empty bottle from my sweater pocket and placed it on the table between us. "This bottle was nearly full 5 days ago. Now it's empty." Sarah stared at the bottle as if it were a snake coiled to strike. "Those aren't mine. They were hidden behind the toilet, in the bathroom you've been using exclusively for 3 weeks. I don't know how they got there. Maybe they're old pills from when I was recovering from the accident. Maybe Tom left them there before we broke up. The lies came so easily, so smoothly, that I realized she'd been practicing them. This wasn't the first time she'd been caught, and she'd learned exactly what to say to deflect blame and create reasonable doubt. Sarah, please, I'm not trying to trap you. I'm trying to help you. If you're using again, we can get you into treatment. We can make sure the baby is safe. Something shifted in Sarah's expression then, a coldness I'd never seen before. The baby is fine. I would never do anything to hurt my baby. Honey, taking 80 milligrams of OxyContin while pregnant could kill your baby. It could cause respiratory depression, premature birth, developmental delays, withdrawal symptoms after birth. As a nurse, I've seen what happens to babies born addicted to opioids, and I won't let that happen to my grandchild. Sarah's face contorted with fury. Your grandchild. This is my baby, not yours, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of my own child without your interference. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking with adrenaline and fear. Not while you're using drugs, you're not. Sarah, I love you more than life itself, but I won't watch you destroy another innocent person with your addiction. You think I'm a monster? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was filled with venom. You think I'm some kind of terrible person who would hurt her own baby. I think you're sick, Sarah. I think you have a disease that makes you do things the healthy part of you would never consider. But being sick doesn't make it okay to risk your child's life. That's when she played the card I'd been dreading since the day she moved back home. If you don't trust me to take care of my own baby, maybe I should leave. Maybe I should go back to Tom, or find somewhere else to stay, where people don't treat me like a criminal. The threat hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. She knew exactly how to manipulate my greatest fear, losing access to both her and my future grandchild. She'd used the same threat during her previous relapses, and it had worked every time. The thought of not knowing where she was, not being able to protect the baby, had always been enough to make me back down. But this time was different. This time, there was an innocent life at stake. I won't enable your addiction anymore, Sarah. That baby deserves better than a mother who's too high to take care of him properly. Her face went white with shock. I'd never refused to back down before, had never chosen the baby's welfare over her feelings. You're choosing a baby you've never met over your own daughter. I'm choosing the safety of an innocent child over your disease. There's a difference. Sarah's mouth opened and closed several times, as if she couldn't find words powerful enough to express her outrage. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking with emotion. Fine. If that's how you feel, maybe it's time everyone knew exactly what kind of mother you really are. Before I could ask what she meant, she pulled out her cell phone and started dialing. Within seconds, I could hear Tom's voice on the other end of the line. Tom, it's me. Can you come pick me up? My mother just accused me of being a drug addict who's going to hurt my baby. She's completely lost her mind. I watched in horror as my daughter performed for an audience, her voice taking on the wounded tone of an innocent victim. She paced around the dining room as she spoke, occasionally shooting me looks of pure hatred. I know. It's insane. She found some old pills and she's convinced I'm using drugs. She's threatening to call child services on me before the baby is even born. I hadn't mentioned child services, but Sarah was already building her narrative, creating a story that would make me look like an unstable grandmother trying to steal her grandchild. Can you be here in 20 minutes? I need to get out of here before she does something crazy. As Sarah ended the call and headed toward the stairs, presumably to pack her belongings, I made a decision that would change everything. Sarah, wait. She turned at the bottom of the staircase, her face flushed with victory. She thought she'd won, that the threat of leaving would make me capitulate like it always had before. I'm calling Dr. Chen. I'm asking him to do an emergency drug screening when Tom gets here. If you're clean, If these pills really aren't yours, then you have nothing to worry about. We'll do the test right here in front of Tom, and I'll apologize for doubting you." The color drained from Sarah's face again, but this time it didn't return. "You can't make me take a drug test. I'm an adult." "You're right, I can't make you. But I can make it a condition of staying in my house and receiving my financial support. And if you refuse, I'm calling Child Protective Services to report suspected drug use during pregnancy." For the first time in our confrontation, Sarah looked genuinely afraid. Not angry, not defiant, but terrified. "Mom, please, you don't understand. It's not what you think." "Then explain it to me. Help me understand why you have 80 OxyContin pills prescribed by a doctor who doesn't exist." Sarah's hands began to shake visibly. She gripped the banister to steady herself, and I watched as the facade she'd been maintaining for weeks finally crumbled. "I can't. If I tell you the truth, everything gets worse." "It can't get worse than risking your baby's life, Sarah." She looked at me with desperation I'd never seen before, and for a moment I thought she might finally confess everything. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and walked back into the dining room where I was standing. "You want to know the truth, Mom? The truth is that you've never trusted me. Not after the accident, not during recovery. Not ever. You've been waiting for me to fail again, and now you're so excited to be right that you're willing to destroy our relationship over some pills that could belong to anyone." Before I could respond, she raised her hand and slapped me across the face. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. My cheek burned with the impact, but the emotional pain was so much worse than the physical sting. In 28 years, Sarah had never raised a hand to me. Even during her worst periods of addiction, even when she'd stolen from me and lied to me and manipulated me, she'd never been physically violent. I stood there with my hand pressed to my cheek, staring at my daughter's face. There was no remorse in her expression, no shock at what she'd just done. There was only cold calculation, as if she'd weighed the consequences of hitting me and decided it was worth it. "There's your proof that I'm a terrible person," she said quietly. "Now you can tell everyone that your drug-addicted daughter hit you while she was pregnant. That should get you all the sympathy you want." At that moment, Tom's car pulled into the driveway, its headlights sweeping across the dining room windows. Sarah grabbed her purse from the counter and headed for the front door, without another word. As I watched her walk out of my house and into Tom's car, carrying my future grandchild with her, I realized that the daughter I'd been trying so desperately to save was already gone. She'd been replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone capable of using her own pregnancy as a weapon against the people who loved her most. But she didn't know that I had a plan to save the one person in this situation who truly couldn't protect himself. After Sarah left that night, I sat in my dining room for what felt like hours, holding a bag of frozen peas against my burning cheek and staring at the empty chair where my daughter had been sitting just minutes before. The silence in the house felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the violence of what had just happened. For the first time in 5 years of dealing with Sarah's addiction, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Absolute clarity. The slap had shocked me, but it had also shattered the last vestiges of denial I'd been clinging to. My pregnant daughter was actively using drugs that could kill my grandchild, and she was willing to hurt anyone who tried to stop her. I picked up my phone and made the first call. "Dr. Chen, it's Margaret Thompson. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I need to ask you about Sarah's prenatal care." My voice was steadier than I'd expected it to be. "Doctor, James Chen had been our family physician for 15 years. He'd delivered Robert, treated Sarah through her teenage years, and provided compassionate care during David's final health crisis. If anyone would understand the gravity of this situation, it was him." Margaret, what's wrong? Is Sarah having complications? I took a deep breath. Dr. Chen, when was the last time you saw Sarah for prenatal care? There was a pause. Margaret, I haven't seen Sarah at all during this pregnancy. I was under the impression she was seeing a specialist somewhere else. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. She's been living with me for 3 weeks, claiming she's been seeing a Dr. Michael Rivera for high-risk pregnancy care. I can't find any record of this doctor existing. Another pause. Longer this time. Margaret, what exactly is going on? I think Sarah is using again. Tonight I found an empty OxyContin bottle prescribed by this Dr. Rivera, and when I confronted her about it, she became violent. She hit me and left with her boyfriend. Dr. Chen's voice became instantly professional, but I could hear the concern underneath. Margaret, if Sarah is using opioids during pregnancy, especially at high doses, both she and the baby are in immediate danger. Have you contacted Child Protective Services? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. If I can get Sarah to come in for an examination and drug screening, would you be willing to see her? Of course, but Margaret, if she's as far along as you've described and she's been using regularly, we may be looking at emergency intervention. The baby could be born with severe withdrawal symptoms, respiratory depression, or worse. After ending the call with Dr. Chen, I walked through my house methodically, checking every room for anything Sarah might have left behind. In the upstairs bathroom she'd been using, I found what I was looking for. A second prescription bottle, this one nearly full, that had rolled under the vanity cabinet. Tramadol, 100 milligrams. Also prescribed by the fictional Dr. Michael Rivera. I took photographs of both bottles with my phone, making sure the prescription information was clearly visible. Then I called Robert in Chicago. Mom, what's wrong? It's almost midnight. I'd been dreading this conversation, but Robert deserved to know what was happening. Your sister is using drugs while she's pregnant, and tonight she hit me when I confronted her about it. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. She hit you? She slapped me across the face, then left with Tom. Robert, I need your help. I think the only way to save this baby is to force Sarah into treatment, but I can't do it alone. What do you need me to do? Can you take some time off work and come home? I have a plan, but I need someone here who can help me execute it. Robert didn't hesitate. I'll drive down tomorrow night after work. Mom, are you okay? Do you need me to come now? I'm okay, sweetheart. Just angry and scared for the baby. The next morning, I began the most difficult investigation of my life. I started by calling every pharmacy within a 20-mile radius, asking if they had any prescriptions on file for Sarah Thompson. I posed as her mother helping her transfer prescriptions to a new pharmacy, a common enough request that most pharmacists were willing to help. By noon, I'd identified 4 different pharmacies where Sarah had filled prescriptions for various pain medications over the past month. All of them were prescribed by doctors I'd never heard of, at addresses that didn't exist when I looked them up online. The quantities were staggering. Over 300 pills of various opioids in just 4 weeks. My next call was to Lisa Martinez. If anyone knew about Sarah's recent activities, it would be her former best friend, who'd always maintained hope that Sarah would eventually get clean. Margaret, how are you? I've been thinking about Sarah since dinner last week. She seemed really out of it. Lisa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has Sarah contacted you recently asking for money or favors? There was a long pause. Yes. 2 weeks ago, she called asking if I could loan her $1,500 for baby furniture. When I offered to go shopping with her instead, she got angry and hung up. Then last week, she called asking if I knew anyone who might want to buy some of the gifts from her baby shower. claiming she'd received duplicates. The pieces were falling into place. Did you buy anything from her? I felt bad saying no, so I bought a car seat she said she didn't need. Margaret, it was still in the box with the tags on it. The receipt showed it had been purchased the day before she called me. So Sarah was buying baby items and immediately selling them for drug money. The manipulation was even more calculated than I'd realized. Lisa, there's something else. I think Sarah is using drugs while she's pregnant. Tonight I'm going to try to get her to come home for a family meeting. Would you be willing to come and help me confront her about what's been happening? Oh my God, Margaret. Yes, of course I'll help. What do you need me to do? Over the next several hours, I developed a strategy that felt both terrifying and necessary. I would call Sarah and tell her I wanted to apologize for my behavior the night before. I'd invite her to dinner, claiming I wanted to discuss how we could work together to ensure the baby's health. When she arrived, Dr. Chen, Lisa, and Robert would all be there to present her with the evidence of her drug use and demand that she enter treatment immediately. If she refused, I would call Child Protective Services and request an emergency court order for supervised prenatal care. The hardest part was contacting Tom Bradley. I'd managed to find his phone number through the phone bill records from when Sarah had lived with me during her previous attempts at sobriety. The conversation was one of the most difficult I'd ever had. Tom, this is Margaret Thompson, Sarah's mother. Mrs. Thompson, look. I don't want any trouble. Sarah said you two had a fight last night, but I'm not getting involved in family drama. Tom, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to tell me the truth. Are you selling drugs to my pregnant daughter? The silence stretched so long I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Tom, I'm not trying to get you in trouble. I'm trying to save my grandchild's life. If you're providing Sarah with prescription medications, that baby could die. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson, I swear I never meant for things to get this bad. Sarah was in so much pain after she moved back home, and she said her mom wasn't helping her get the medication she needed. So Sarah had been manipulating Tom too, convincing him that I was withholding necessary medical care rather than trying to prevent her from relapsing. Tom, how long has this been going on? Since about a week after she moved in with you. She called me crying, saying you were treating her like a child and refusing to let her see doctors who would actually help her. She begged me to help her find someone who would prescribe proper pain management for her pregnancy complications. What kind of complications? Another pause. She said the baby was pressing on old injuries from her car accident, causing severe pain that regular doctors wouldn't treat because they were afraid of liability issues. Even in the midst of active addiction, Sarah was a masterful manipulator. She'd convinced Tom that he was helping her access legitimate medical care rather than enabling her drug use. Tom, Dr. Michael Rivera doesn't exist. The prescriptions Sarah has been getting are forged or obtained illegally. The medications she's taking could kill both her and the baby. I heard him take a shaky breath. Oh, God. Mrs. Thompson, what do I do? I love Sarah, but I can't be responsible for hurting a baby. I need you to help me get her into treatment. Are you willing to do that? Yes. Yes, whatever you need me to do. By Thursday evening, all the pieces were in place. Robert had driven down from Chicago and was staying in the guest room. Dr. Chen had cleared his schedule for an emergency consultation. Lisa had arranged to be at my house by 6 o'clock, and Tom had agreed to bring Sarah to dinner under the pretense that he wanted to apologize for their part in the previous night's argument. I spent the afternoon preparing Sarah's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, homemade dinner rolls, and apple pie for dessert. If this was going to be the last time I cooked for my daughter before she went into treatment, I wanted it to be special. As I set the dining room table with my good china, the same dishes I'd used for every important family occasion for the past 28 years. I realized that this intervention was either going to save Sarah's life or destroy our relationship forever. But looking at the photographs I'd taken of those prescription bottles, imagining my future grandchild fighting for his life because of his mother's addiction, I knew I didn't have a choice. The perfect moment had arrived. Sarah walked through my front door at exactly 6 o'clock on Friday evening, looking more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Her pregnancy bump seemed more pronounced under the loose sweater she was wearing, but her face was gaunt, and her eyes held that familiar glassy look that told me she'd taken something before coming over. Tom followed behind her, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. Mom, Tom, and I wanted to apologize for how things went the other night, Sarah said, her voice artificially bright. We've been talking, and we think maybe we can work together to make sure the baby stays healthy. I forced a smile, even though my heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. I'm glad you both came. I've made your favorite dinner, sweetheart. Pot roast with all the fixings. As Sarah and Tom took their seats at the dining room table, I watched her scan the room with the hypervigilance of someone expecting trouble. She noticed Robert immediately, sitting in his usual chair across from where she'd chosen to sit. "Robert, what are you doing here? Don't you have to work?" My son smiled at his sister with genuine warmth, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. "I took some time off to come see you. I wanted to meet my future nephew in person before he arrives." Sarah relaxed slightly, but I noticed her hands were shaking as she reached for her water glass. The tremor was subtle but consistent, the kind I'd seen in patients experiencing withdrawal between doses. "Where's Dr. Chen?" I asked Lisa quietly, as she helped me carry serving dishes from the kitchen. "He's parked outside. He said he'll wait for your signal." As we all settled around the table, I tried to maintain the pretense of a normal family dinner. I asked Tom about his work, complimented Sarah on how radiant she looked, and encouraged Robert to tell us about his latest projects in Chicago. But underneath the polite conversation, I was studying my daughter's behavior with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 35 years recognizing the signs of medical distress. Sarah was having difficulty following the conversation. When Robert asked her about her due date, she paused for a long time before answering, as if she had to work to remember the information. When I asked if she'd felt the baby moving today, she looked confused and touched her belly, as if she'd forgotten she was pregnant. Most concerning of all, she kept nodding off between bites of food. Her eyes would drift closed, her chin would drop toward her chest, and then she'd jerk awake and pretend she'd just been thinking deeply about something. "Sarah, honey, are you feeling all right?" I asked gently. "You seem exhausted." "I'm fine, Mom. Just the pregnancy, you know. It takes a lot out of you." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I could see the guilt written across his face as he watched Sarah struggle to maintain her composure. When our eyes met across the table, I gave him a small nod. This was the moment we'd planned for. "Sarah," Tom said quietly, "I think we need to tell your family the truth." Sarah's head snapped up, instantly alert despite her obvious intoxication. "What truth? Tom, what are you talking about?" "About the pills, about Dr. Rivera, about what's really been happening these past few weeks." The change in Sarah's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The drowsy, confused woman who'd been struggling to stay awake suddenly became sharp and focused, like a cornered animal preparing to fight. "Tom, shut up! We agreed we weren't going to talk about this." Robert looked between his sister and Tom with growing alarm. "Talk about what? Sarah, what's going on?" That's when I pulled out the 2 prescription bottles I'd found and placed them on the table next to Sarah's plate. "These are what we need to talk about," I said quietly. "OxyContin and Tramadol, both prescribed by a doctor who doesn't exist, found hidden in our bathroom. Sarah, you've consumed over 250 pills in the past month while you've been pregnant." Sarah stared at the bottles as if they were explosive devices. Those aren't mine. I don't know how they got in the bathroom. Tom, I said, turning to look at him directly. Would you like to tell everyone how Sarah has been getting these medications? Tom's face crumpled. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson. I never meant for it to go this far. Sarah called me a few weeks after she moved back in with you, crying, saying you weren't letting her see doctors who would help her with pregnancy pain from her old injuries. Robert's expression was shifting from confusion to horror. Sarah, is this true? Are you using drugs while you're pregnant? It's not what you think, Sarah said desperately. I have legitimate pain from when the baby presses against my old fractures. These medications are prescribed for a real medical condition by Dr. Michael Rivera, I said. Who doesn't exist. I've called every hospital, every medical practice, every licensing board within 200 miles. There is no Dr. Michael Rivera. Lisa spoke up from her position near the kitchen doorway. Sarah, 2 weeks ago you tried to sell me a brand new car seat, claiming you'd received duplicates at your baby shower. But you haven't had a baby shower yet. The lies were closing in around Sarah from all sides, and I could see her starting to panic. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and she gripped the edge of the table with both hands. This is an ambush, she said, her voice rising. You planned this. You brought everyone here to gang up on me. That's when I texted Dr. Chen. Come in now. 2 minutes later, there was a gentle knock on the front door. When I opened it, Dr. Chen stepped into the entryway, carrying his medical bag. Hello, Margaret. Sarah. He nodded professionally at my daughter, who had gone completely white. I understand there are some concerns about prenatal care that we need to address. Dr. Chen, Sarah stammered. I don't need to see you. I have my own doctor. Dr. Michael Rivera. Dr. Chen said calmly. Yes, your mother mentioned him. I'd be very interested to meet this colleague of mine since I can't find any record of him in any medical database. Tom stood up abruptly from his chair. Sarah, tell them the truth, please. If something happens to the baby because we waited too long, I'll never forgive myself. Tom, don't you dare! Sarah hissed. We had an agreement. The agreement is off, Tom said, his voice shaking. Mrs. Thompson, Sarah has been buying pills from a guy named Marcus who works at the warehouses downtown. He gets them from people who sell their legitimate prescriptions, then creates fake labels with made-up doctor names. Sarah's been spending about $300 a week on pills since she moved back home. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Robert pushed his chair back from the table, staring at his sister in disbelief. Lisa covered her mouth with her hand, tears starting to form in her eyes. Sarah, Dr. Chen said gently, I need to examine you and the baby immediately. If you've been taking high doses of opioids throughout your pregnancy, both of your lives could be in danger. No, Sarah said, standing up so quickly that her chair fell over backward. I'm not staying here to be humiliated by my own family. Tom, we're leaving. But Tom remained seated. I'm not leaving, Sarah. I'm not going to help you hurt this baby anymore. For the first time since she'd walked through my door, Sarah seemed to understand that she was completely alone. Everyone in the room, everyone who claimed to love her, was aligned against her. You're all acting like I'm some kind of monster who doesn't care about her own baby, she said, her voice breaking. But I would never hurt my child. Never. Dr. Chen opened his medical bag and pulled out a portable ultrasound device. Then let me examine the baby right now. If everything is fine, if the baby is developing normally despite your medication use, then we can discuss outpatient treatment options. And if the baby isn't fine, Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, then we need to get you both to the hospital immediately for emergency intervention. Sarah looked around the room at all of us, her family and friends who had spent years enabling her addiction out of love and hope and desperate denial. For a moment, I thought she might finally surrender, finally admit that she needed help. Instead, she turned toward the front door. "Sarah, please!" I called after her. "Don't leave. Let Dr. Chen help you." She paused at the doorway and looked back at me with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't anger or defiance or fear. It was complete and utter defeat. "I can't stop, Mom," she whispered. "I've tried so many times to stop, but I can't. And now it's too late to save either of us." She walked out of my house and into the November evening, leaving behind the family who loved her and the help she desperately needed. But she didn't know that the best part was still to come. As Sarah walked out of my house that Friday evening, I didn't run after her. I didn't beg her to come back, didn't promise to stop pushing for treatment, didn't make any of the desperate compromises that had enabled her addiction for the past 5 years. Instead, I turned to Dr. Chen and said the hardest words I'd ever spoken as a mother. "I need you to call the Child Protective Services. Tonight." The silence in the dining room was deafening. Robert stared at me with a mixture of admiration and horror. Lisa sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her. Tom stood by the window watching Sarah disappear down the street, tears streaming down his face. "Margaret," Dr. Chen said gently, "are you sure you want to take this step? Once CPS gets involved, you won't be able to control how this situation unfolds." "I can't control it now," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "But maybe they can save that baby before it's too late." Dr. Chen made the call from my kitchen while I cleared the untouched dinner from the table. Within 30 minutes, a CPS caseworker named Janet Morrison was sitting in my living room, taking detailed notes as I explained everything I'd discovered about Sarah's drug use during her pregnancy. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to understand that what you're reporting will likely result in immediate intervention," Janet explained. "If we can locate your daughter and confirm substance abuse during pregnancy, the court can order mandatory inpatient treatment and supervised prenatal care." "What happens to the baby?" Robert asked. "If Sarah complies with treatment and demonstrates sobriety, she'll maintain custody with supervision. If she doesn't..." Janet paused. "The baby could be removed from her care immediately after birth and placed in emergency custody, likely with family members if they're suitable." The weight of what I was setting in motion hit me like a physical blow. I was potentially taking my grandchild away from his mother before he was even born. But then I thought about those prescription bottles, about Sarah nodding off at the dinner table, about the tremor in her hands that had gotten worse over the past weeks. "Do it," I said. The next 24 hours were a blur of legal proceedings that felt like an out-of-body experience. Janet Morrison worked with remarkable efficiency, obtaining an emergency court order for Sarah's psychiatric evaluation and supervised prenatal care. By Saturday evening, police had located Sarah and Tom at a motel on the outskirts of town. According to the police report, they found Sarah unconscious in the bathroom with an empty bottle of OxyContin beside her. She'd overdosed while 7 months pregnant. Tom called me from the hospital at 11:30 that night, sobbing so hard I could barely understand what he was saying. "Mrs. Thompson, they're doing emergency surgery. The baby, they have to deliver the baby right now. Sarah almost died. The baby almost died. Oh God, what have we done?" I drove to the hospital in a state of shock that felt almost like floating. Robert met me in the parking lot, having driven straight down from Chicago when Tom called him. Together, we walked into a situation that was both my worst nightmare and the inevitable conclusion of years of enabling Sarah's addiction. Sarah was in surgery for an emergency cesarean section. The baby was in distress from oxygen deprivation caused by Sarah's overdose. Dr. Martinez, the neonatal specialist, explained that the next 72 hours would be critical for determining whether my grandson had suffered permanent brain damage from his mother's drug use. "The baby is in withdrawal," Dr. Martinez told us as we stood outside the NICU, looking through the glass at a tiny infant connected to more machines than seemed possible. Neonatal abstinence syndrome. He's experiencing the same withdrawal symptoms an adult would have, but his little body doesn't understand what's happening to him. I watched my grandson through that glass partition, his tiny body trembling with involuntary muscle spasms, his cry so high-pitched and distressed that it cut through me like a knife. He'd been born 3 weeks early, weighing just 4 pounds, 2 ounces, and his first experience in the world was the agony of drug withdrawal. "How long will this last?" Robert asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Could be days. Could be weeks. We're treating him with morphine to ease the withdrawal symptoms, then gradually reducing the dose. It's essentially the same process adult addicts go through in detox, except he's a newborn who never chose to be addicted to anything." Sarah remained unconscious for 18 hours after the surgery. When she finally woke up, her first words were asking about the baby. I was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, when her eyes fluttered open. "Mom, is the baby okay?" The hope in her voice was heartbreaking. Despite everything that had happened, despite the overdose and the emergency surgery, and the machines keeping her son alive, she still didn't understand the full scope of what her addiction had cost. "He's alive," I said carefully. "But Sarah, he's going through withdrawal. His nervous system is dependent on the drugs you were taking, and now that he's not getting them anymore, his body is in crisis." Sarah turned her head toward the window, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant for this to happen. I thought I could control it. I thought I could protect him." "I know you did, sweetheart. But addiction isn't something you can control with good intentions." Over the next few days, the full extent of the consequences began to unfold. CPS had been granted temporary custody of the baby, which meant that even after he was medically stable, Sarah wouldn't be able to take him home unless she completed inpatient treatment and demonstrated sustained sobriety. The hospital's social worker, a compassionate woman named Patricia Hayes, explained the legal situation to Sarah during one of my visits. "You have options, Sarah. You can enter a residential treatment program that allows you to be with your baby during his recovery, or you can complete treatment separately and work toward a supervised reunification. But right now, you don't have the option to take him home." Sarah's face crumpled. "He needs his mother. Babies are supposed to be with their mothers. He needs a mother who can take care of him safely," Patricia replied gently. "Right now, that means a mother who isn't using drugs." The treatment center Sarah ultimately chose was a 90-day residential program specifically designed for pregnant women and new mothers struggling with addiction. The facility allowed her to spend supervised time with the baby once he was medically stable, but she couldn't take him back to her room unsupervised. I'll never forget the day I was finally allowed to hold my grandson. He was 2 weeks old, still tiny and fragile, but the worst of the withdrawal symptoms had passed. When the nurse placed him in my arms, he opened his eyes and looked directly at me with the most alert, intelligent gaze I'd ever seen in a newborn. "Hello, little one," I whispered. "I'm your grandmother, Margaret, and I'm going to make sure you're safe." As I held him in that quiet NICU room, I realized that the hardest decision of my life had been the right one. If I hadn't called CPS when I did, if I had continued enabling Sarah's addiction out of fear of losing her, this baby might not have survived. The overdose might have killed both of them. Tom had been arrested on drug-dealing charges after admitting to providing Sarah with pills throughout her pregnancy. He was facing 3 to 5 years in prison, though he was cooperating fully with authorities and had provided information that led to the arrest of Marcus, the supplier who had been selling prescription drugs throughout our community. Lisa Martinez became an unexpected source of strength during those early weeks. She organized a support network of friends and church members who helped cover medical expenses and provided meals during the long hospital vigil. She also researched addiction recovery resources and found a support group for families of addicts that met twice weekly at the community center. Robert took a leave of absence from his job in Chicago to help me navigate the legal and medical complexities of the situation. Having him home during such a difficult time reminded me that not all of my children had been consumed by addiction, that it was possible to love Sarah while still protecting the innocent life she'd endangered. The most difficult conversation came 3 weeks after the baby was born, when Sarah was stable in treatment and able to discuss what would happen next. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," she said during one of my visits to the treatment center. "What is it, sweetheart?" "If I can't get clean, if I can't stay sober, will you take care of him? Will you raise him?" The question I had been dreading had finally been asked directly. "Sarah, you're going to get clean. You're going to be the mother he needs. But if I can't, if I'm too broken to fix, will you make sure he has a good life?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone I barely recognized. The drugs had aged her beyond her 28 years. Her hair was thin and brittle, her skin had a grayish pallor, and her hands shook constantly from the medication they were using to manage her withdrawal. But her eyes when she asked about her son's future were clearer than they'd been in months. "Yes," I said. "If that's what it takes to keep him safe, yes. I will raise him and love him and make sure he knows that his mother loved him too." A year later, everything had changed in ways I could never have imagined. 1 year later, I'm sitting in the nursery that used to be Sarah's childhood bedroom, watching my grandson David play with wooden blocks on the carpet. At 15 months old, he's a miracle of resilience and healing. The tremors that shook his tiny body during those first weeks of withdrawal are long gone. The high-pitched crying that once echoed through the NICU has been replaced by babbling conversations with his stuffed animals and delighted giggles when I read him stories. He's reaching all his developmental milestones on schedule, despite the doctor's initial concerns about potential cognitive delays from his prenatal drug exposure. His first word was "Nana," which made me cry tears of joy and relief in equal measure. When he takes his tentative steps around the living room, holding onto furniture for support, I see no trace of the neurological damage that could have been his lifelong burden. The name David was my choice, honoring the grandfather he'll never meet, but whose gentle spirit I try to channel every day as I raise this precious boy. Robert suggested we call him Davy, and the nickname has stuck perfectly with his bright, curious personality. Sarah completed the 90-day residential treatment program and has been living in a transitional housing facility for recovering mothers ever since. She's been clean for 11 months now, the longest period of sustained sobriety she's achieved since her addiction began 5 years ago. Every Tuesday and Saturday afternoon, she comes to my house for supervised visits with David, and I can see glimpses of the daughter I remember from before the car accident changed everything. The visits are both heartbreaking and hopeful. Sarah sits on the living room floor, building towers of blocks that David delights in knocking down, reading him picture books in the same gentle voice she used to use with her baby dolls when she was 4 years old. But there's a distance in her eyes sometimes, a wariness that comes from knowing how easily she could lose this precious time with her son if she makes the wrong choice. "Mom, do you think he'll remember me if I can't stay clean?" she asked during last week's visit, watching David chase soap bubbles I'd blown across the backyard. The question cut through me like a knife. "Sarah, you are staying clean. You're doing the work. You're taking your recovery seriously, and you're building a relationship with your son. But if I fail again, if I relapse, will you tell him about the good parts? Will you tell him I loved him?" I reached over and took her hand, noticing how much steadier her fingers are now compared to those desperate weeks before David was born. I'll tell him about the mother who sang to him every night during her pregnancy, even when she was struggling. I'll tell him about the mother who chose treatment instead of running away when things got hard. I'll tell him that sometimes people get sick with diseases that make them do things they never wanted to do. But that doesn't mean they love their children any less. The legal situation remains complicated but hopeful. Sarah has completed parenting classes, passed every drug test for the past 11 months, and demonstrated what the social workers call genuine engagement with her recovery process. If she maintains her sobriety for another 6 months, the court will consider transitioning David to unsupervised visits with the ultimate goal of reunification. But if she relapses, if she fails another drug test or misses appointments or returns to the destructive patterns that characterized her addiction, I will become David's permanent guardian. The paperwork is already filed, the home study has been completed, and my financial situation has been reviewed. At 59 years old, I'm prepared to raise another child, if that's what it takes to keep him safe. Tom Bradley was sentenced to 3 years in prison for drug distribution, but he'll be eligible for parole in 18 months due to his cooperation with authorities and his genuine remorse for his role in Sarah's relapse. He writes letters to Sarah occasionally, apologizing over and over for enabling her addiction and expressing gratitude that David survived, despite their mistakes. Sarah doesn't respond to his letters, but she keeps them in a shoebox in her room at the transitional house. The drug dealer Marcus received a much harsher sentence, 8 years in federal prison, after authorities discovered he'd been supplying prescription medications to over 40 people in our community, including several other pregnant women. The investigation that began with Sarah's case led to the dismantling of a network that had been operating for nearly 3 years. Lisa Martinez has become an invaluable source of support, both for me and for Sarah. She attends some of the supervised visits, bringing a perspective of unconditional friendship that doesn't carry the complicated weight of family history. Last month, she started volunteering with a nonprofit organization that provides support services for families affected by addiction. Robert comes home from Chicago every few weeks to spend time with David and check on the situation. Watching my son play with his nephew, seeing the natural affection between them, gives me hope that David will grow up surrounded by love, even if his path to stability has been unconventional. Dr. Chen continues to provide David's pediatric care, and his regular reports to the court consistently show a healthy, thriving toddler with no apparent lasting effects from his prenatal drug exposure. However, he's cautioned me that some impacts of neonatal abstinence syndrome don't manifest until school age, when learning disabilities or attention deficits might become apparent. We'll monitor him carefully, Dr. Chen assured me during David's last checkup. But Margaret, you should be incredibly proud of how well he's doing. The early intervention, the stable home environment, the consistent care you've provided, all of that gives him the best possible chance for a completely normal life. The financial cost of this situation has been substantial. My retirement savings are completely depleted. My house is mortgaged to its maximum value, and I've had to take on credit card debt to cover legal fees and medical expenses. But I've learned something important about priorities over this past year. Money can be earned and debts can be repaid, but a child's life and future can't be recovered once they're lost. The most difficult lesson I've learned is about the difference between love and enabling. For years, I thought that loving Sarah meant protecting her from the consequences of her addiction. I thought that if I just gave her enough money, enough chances, enough unconditional support, she would eventually choose recovery on her own. I was wrong. Real love sometimes means making choices that feel like betrayal in the moment, but are actually acts of salvation. Calling Child Protective Services on my pregnant daughter was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it saved David's life. The overdose that precipitated his emergency birth could have killed both of them if I had continued enabling Sarah's addiction by providing money and housing, without demanding accountability. Sometimes the greatest act of love is saying no. I learned that protecting my grandson meant being willing to lose my daughter, temporarily, to save them both permanently. The relationship between Sarah and me is healing slowly. There's still tension, still moments when I can see resentment in her eyes for the choice I made to involve authorities. But there are also moments when she looks at David playing happily in my living room and whispers, "Thank you for saving him when I couldn't save myself." Trust is something that has to be rebuilt gradually, one clean drug test at a time, one kept appointment at a time, one honest conversation at a time. I'm hopeful but realistic about Sarah's chances of maintaining long-term sobriety. Addiction is a chronic disease, and relapses are statistically common. But she has something now she didn't have during her previous attempts at recovery. A son who needs her to succeed. As I watch David toddle around my backyard on this crisp November afternoon, chasing leaves that flutter down from the oak tree David and I planted when we first moved into this house, I think about the different ways families can be formed and reformed by crisis. This isn't the way I expected to spend my early retirement years. I thought I'd be traveling, volunteering at the hospital, maybe taking painting classes at the community college. Instead, I'm learning about toddler nutrition, researching preschools, and child-proofing cabinets for the second time in my life. But when David wraps his small arms around my neck and says, "Love you, Nana," in his sweet, clear voice, I know that every sacrifice has been worth it. If you've had to make tough decisions to protect your family, if you've been forced to choose between enabling someone you love and saving someone who can't protect themselves, I want you to know that you're not alone. Sometimes being called the villain is a small price to pay for being someone's guardian angel. Trust your instincts. When someone you love is in danger, being hated temporarily is better than living with regret permanently. Share your story in the comments if you've been through something similar. Sometimes we all need to hear that we made the right choice, even when it was the hardest choice imaginable.